Stories are powerful. Studies, in fact, show that our brains are built to learn stories. Stories grab and maintain attention and help us to understand and remember messages. Stories touch the emotions and create empathy, understanding, and compassion, and it can lead to action. Now, God did not have to have studies to know this. God created that in us. And as we read through this passage, actually 3 times in these 8 verses, we see God understand the power of stories, and so He encourages those who He's reading to or speaking to, He's encouraging those to go ahead and tell stories. Verse 4 again, tell the generation to come. Verse 5, speaking of the testimony, another word for story, the psalmist states for the reader to teach them to their children. And in verse 6, the children are to arise, grow, mature, and then they are to tell the testimony and the commands to their children. The story of the Israelites is a story of hope and a story of help from the Lord. Verse 12 and following speaks of a recap of sorts of some of the great things God has done, some of the awesome wonders of God. It says there in verse 13 that He divided the Red Sea and caused the Israelites and several million of them to walk on dry ground. With a cloud by day and a fire by night, verse 15 and 16 tells us God led them through the wilderness. That's verse 14. And then verses 15 through 16 it talks about how He split the rock and provided water. And not just a little bit of trickle, but it says there in Scriptures that He provided not just a few drops, but water abundant as the ocean depths. We've got a town of maybe 15, 16, 17,000 people. And I know over time we've struggled about, we're going to have enough water for us. Well, imagine 2 or 3 million people traveling through the desert, wondering whether they're going to have enough water for them. And yet what does God do? He breaks open a rock and provides water as deep as the ocean's depths. And yet, in the midst of those wonders, in the midst of those amazing things, Scripture tells us also, as we know, that the Israelites, Ephraim is the word used here for them, one of Joseph's sons, but speaks of all of the Israelites. In spite of experiencing all that God has done, what did they do? They became rebellious and disobedient. Twice the psalmist attributes this fall into rebellion and disobedience to the lack of remembering who God is and what He's done. Verse 11 says, they forgot God's deeds and His miracles that He had shown them. Verse 42, they did not remember His power, the day when He redeemed them from the adversary. They had forgotten. And so parents, we have a role. We have a role to remind our kids, to tell God stories to them, truths of who God is. I don't care where you start, just start. Find a place and start telling the stories of who God is. Tell the story of David and Goliath. We love telling that story of the 5 smooth stones that David took and how he put one in the sling and around and around and around it went until it fell and it hit Goliath right in the forehead and knocked him down to the ground, and where David came and chopped off his head. We love telling that story. So many truths, great truths in that story, like the truth that scary, mean, angry, loud, and awful things are no match for a living God. Amen. And those who serve in His name.